How'd you like to listen to .NET Rocks with no ads? Easy. Become a patron. For just $5 a month, you get access to a private RSS feed where all the shows have no ads. $20 a month will get you that and a special .NET Rocks patron mug. Sign up now at patreon.netrocks.com. Hey, guess what? It's .NET Rocks. I'm Carl Franklin.
And I'm Richard Campbell.
And we're representing 4 time zones today.
Nice.
We have 2 guests, everybody in their own time zone.
Yeah. We're in their little corner of the world.
In their little corner of the world. And however, electrons do not observe time zones, so we can all be together on this call.
I think they observe it a little bit.
Maybe. Maybe a little bit.
Apple has some software. There's an old reference for you. Just yank that one out of nowhere. What a great
story that was.
It's a great story.
But Carl, Apple's got some software coming out. All right.
Speed of light, hard to beat.
Yeah. It's kind of the law. Buckle up.
Funny how that works.
Well, let's get right into it with Better Know Framework.
Awesome. All right, man, what do you got?
Well, I found this series on Microsoft Learn that is really cool. And you know what's great about this is that it's fundamental stuff, right? Leveraging branches with GitHub and Visual Studio.
Nice.
And intermediate series. It doesn't talk over your head and it doesn't talk down to you, but there are those guys on the team that are afraid of GitHub and afraid of Git, I used to be one of them.
Sure. And it's so heavily integrated into Studio now. Just make your life pretty easy.
Yep. So, this is required learning. And so even if you know this stuff and you think you know it, it's good to brush up on it, especially if you're in charge of, teaching other people on your team, all about it. But anyway, I put a link to it. It's, since this is episode 1887, you can go to 1887.pwop.me and that'll get you there. It's had, 2,500 views since January 15th.
Yeah. It was just put up a little while ago.
Yeah. It's very good.
It's cool.
And a lot of thumbs up. And I watched it, and it's good. Know it, learn it, love it. Who's talking to us today, Richard?
I grabbed a comment off of show 1869, which is from last fall, October 2023, when we were at NDC Porto.
Oh, yeah.
In an on-stage interview with one Charity Majors from a company called Honeycomb.
That
Not
was
to put any terrible pressure on Martin or anything, but she was awesome.
I don't know if Martin is going to have, and Steve are going to have as many F-bombs, however.
No, but that's not a bad thing either. And just to reinforce the point, and G. Houseworth had this comment, which he said, I never miss an episode of .NET Rocks because they absolutely rock. And this episode with Charity Majors was none, if not the best.
Yeah, no pressure. The
insight and energy was awesome. And we did have the distinct advantage of being on stage with her, too. We were at NDC Porto at the time. Mm-hmm. But, we're talking about observability more and more, and I'm really looking forward to getting into this one because we've got a couple of different viewpoints coming at it. But if you want to get started on the subject, that show we did with Charity, no fooling, it was great.
It was great.
G, thanks so much for your comment, and a copy of Music Code By. It's on its way to you. And if you'd like a copy of Music Code By, write a comment on the website at .netrocks.com or on the Facebooks. We publish every show there. And if you comment there and I read it on the show, we'll send you a copy of Music Code By.
And you can follow us on Twitter if you want, but the cool kids are at Mastodon. And, I put all of my social media links at carlfranklin.com.
Cool.
So we don't have to just rattle them off. I got a bunch of them up there.
I think I've got a richard.campbell.me, one of the About Me pages that has a whole bunch of that stuff up there too. Have I actually looked at it recently? I don't know. I think I did it when we were doing the mass account thing.
Yeah.
But it is.
But you're at Rich Campbell on Twitter, and what's your Mastodon?
And Rich Campbell at mastodon.social,
Yeah.
Oh, no, it's rcampbell.me. There you go. rcampbell.me.
All right.
It's got them all.
Well, I'm going to just start talking about that. carlfranklin.com. Just go there.
You want to do that now? Okay, I like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Shorter.
Yeah, it is shorter. And, then everybody has a lot more to read that they didn't want to. So too long? Don't read.
Yeah.
Go away. So let's bring on our guests, Steve Gordon and Martin Thwaites. Steve is a Pluralsight author, Microsoft MVP, and engineer at Elastic, maintaining their .NET libraries. Steve enjoys sharing his knowledge by presenting talks at user groups and conferences, writing on his blog at stevejgordon.co.uk, and creating videos. You can find him on most social media platforms under the username at stevejgordon. Martin Thwaites is an observability evangelist, a .NET developer and Microsoft MVP. He works for Honeycomb.io, an observability vendor, as a developer advocate. He travels the world spreading the good word about OpenTelemetry and observability engineering. He'll talk to anyone about observability, even the likes of us, jamokes.
That's not very nice.
Well, So, welcome, guys.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So this culminated in the fishbowl at NDC London, right?
Yeah, we were all hanging out. I was taking it easy because co-host wasn't there. So at some point, somebody just declared it Richard's office. There was a few other I think Mishman came in and recorded some shows. Like, there's a few folks who came and went and used it. I did some run-asses while I was there.
Yeah,
too,
good.
Mostly we sat around. I do believe a couple of bottles of whiskey may have just disappeared into that room and never were seen again.
as they do.
As they do.
Well, Steve is in the UK and it's afternoon there, or evening, right? So you've got your whiskey there, Steve?
That's right. Yeah, I'm declaring it post 6 p.m. Fine time to drink.
Right. I am going tonight to Texas de Brazil with Robert Ramsey.
Nice.
Richard. Yeah. And we will, I'm sure, have plenty of meat and whiskey. So anyway, what do you guys think of following up with on Charity's talk here? Are you scared or are you up to the challenge?
I think Martin said that very well, don't you?
Said it very well, yeah. He answered that question.
I mean, F-bombs is kind of our company policy.
Nice.
No kidding.
I'm not saying it's part of the interview process, but I'm not saying that either.
That is so cool. I mean, let's think about it for a second. I mean, who are you going to offend, right? Yeah. You go to any movie, even if it's PG and there's F-bombs everywhere,
not
right?
Everywhere. But, I mean, we do get some email from folks on set when they show up. We do try to bleep them, too.
Yes, we do.
But I appreciate the sentiment. Either way, it's like there's so much of observability that falls into the what the heck is going on in this app kind
or
of
in this
category.
case, what the F is going on in this?
I was, trying to be Canadian here.
Yeah, we have a, you've heard of MTTR, the mean time to recovery. And so we have a thing called MTTWTF, which is when you're debugging systems, it's how long does it take you to go, what the was that? No, that thing doesn't call that thing. That doesn't happen. It's like, no,
that's not right at all.
So what I haven't used this, Honeycomb, but what I remember distinctly about that conversation was, it's architecturally different from a lot of other, well-known telemetry kind of things that you hook on or add on sidecars, and to get any kind of insight and observability into what's going on in your application, at places where you just can't put a breakpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the whole tracing debate versus logs and APM type stuff, where tracing is the thing that's different. It's the evolution, if you like, of that idea of just log everything, throw it in a big bucket, try and run some log stash things on the back of it, or Fluent stuff to build it all and try and get a picture. It's really the tracing stuff that is the sort of next evolution it's not new, and that's the thing that really gets me.
Yeah, I was going to say, we've had tracing for a long time, but what's new about Honeycomb tracing?
So, well, Honeycomb is just a backend. We just take spans and allow you to query them in weird and wonderful ways in rapid fire. The idea of an outage going on, and you're waiting 5 minutes for telemetry data to get through for you to ask a question to say, did I fix it? Is it now fixed? That idea of just rapid fire, ask questions, because that's really what you want to do. You want that conversation with your production system that's like, what's happening? Who hurt you?
Yeah.
And that's really what we're trying to do.
Show me where the bad man. Yeah. I get it.
Couldn't help but notice your pain.
But that's what we try to do is really try to allow people to just ask weird and wonderful questions. The example we use is what happens when the French user is currently in Norway using the French language pack in the Norway region on iOS 14.1, and that's the error that's happening. It's only on those users,
right?
Because that's where we are with systems now. There's no longer this system that you use inside of your organization that only your users are only your organizational users. Everything's global. People are working from home, working from anywhere. So even if you've got just an internal system, these people are from everywhere now. So we're starting to get into a world where things have changed. It's not about I've got a 6-month release cycle. I can wait 6 months. I can do a QA cycle. And my whole thing at the moment is if we don't change the tools. And I'm not talking about the vendor backends. I'm talking about like OpenTelemetry and tracing and profiles that are coming up and various other signals that are coming out. If we don't give people better tools, but we're saying you need to do things better than you did before, it's not okay.
Yeah. Yeah. The reliability strategy of be more careful next time.
Yeah. Don't do that.
Yeah. Don't touch that. It's, the real point here is the tools should lead us to the path of success. They should resist us making mistakes. And so we get to still be human and have reliable software. What a concept.
Yeah. And I mean, that was, I think from my experience, that was one of the problems with just sort of relying on logging as your observability. Logging and a few metrics was us doing observability, but logging can be quite good if you spend a heck of a lot of time, and I use heck there, heck of a lot of time getting the logging in that you need. It tends to be quite retrospective. You figure out there's a problem in a particular code path, you put a new log in, you ship to production, you wait for someone else to hit the error, and it logs something else that gives you another clue of where you might want to log next.
Right.
And so it's very retrospective and looking back. Whereas with traces, if you design them well and you put tracing around your key points in your application code, you get the full, waterfall effect of what's happened. And you've added hopefully decent attributes on there so that you can, as Martin said, go back and answer any weird and wonderful questions and combinations of events with particular attributes on them.
Awesome. And Steve, I got to ask you, I normally resist 2 guest shows because you end up with a lot of voices. But we're talking observability, and Martin works for the company, arguably, that makes one of the most popular observability tools out there. Does Elastic use Honeycomb, or is it just, you're trying to understand what your own product does? What's the story there?
So we provide an application performance monitoring solution as well. So we compete in a nice, friendly way. So we have a different backend. Our backend's built on top of Elasticsearch, which is kind of Elastic's main product. And our APM server uses that as the data store. So you can ship your telemetry data to us. You can use our APM agent to do that, or today you can also use any OpenTelemetry capable agent as well. So the sort of built-in, what we call the vanilla OpenTelemetry SDK, can be used to ship over the OpenTelemetry protocol directly into Elastic APM server, and then we'll store that for you, and then give you a different form of UI to search over those traces and those logs.
I'm just staggered at the idea that we're talking about Elastic for something other than search. Like, what? I know I thought they made other products, but when have we ever discussed that? So, okay, so this is the Elastic has their APM product, which is another aspect of them, but you both guys are into observability in a big way.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that the real, one of the reasons why I thought it was really good that we're both here is because different backends provide you with different querying capabilities.
Right.
The idea that you just buy one tool off the shelf and everything just works is just not going to work in today's world.
Oh, no, you really need crazy talk, Mr. Thwaites.
You really need to think about what's going to work for your organization. What are you trying to achieve with observability? And then choose the backends that work. And that's where OpenTelemetry is really awesome, because you can send it to 2 providers. You can send that same exact data to two separate providers and say, well, this one's really good at metrics. It's really good at showing me some dashboards about pre-aggregated data. Awesome. That's a really good tool for that thing. It does infrastructure metrics. There's one that does, say, costing, and takes your metrics and can project costs based on previous metrics. Those are really cool tools. There's other ones that focus on, say, serverless. There's other ones that focus on, everything's just, they've got their own niches. Elastic has their own niche. We have our own niche. So OpenTelemetry just makes it easy as your needs change. You can change provider. There's no, I'm going to change provider. Well, install the new agent on 1,500 machines. Right. Nobody's going to do that. Or now it's, I'm going to move vendor. I'll change 3 lines of config.
Right. Now, speaking of that, you bring up pain, right? Let's say I've got a app in production and I've got, thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of lines of code. How does one just retrofit this kind of tracing into an app like that? Obviously, there isn't any kind of wizard where you can just snap your fingers and it's poof, instant insights, right?
10 lines of code?
Yeah. 10 lines of code, and not for every object and every page. And
so, the thing is, with OpenTelemetry, we've got 3 core signals. We've got tracing, we've got metrics, and we've got logs. Tracing is predominantly backend. It's focused on this idea of we've got a context. So a trace is a context, a thing that's been done. So it really works best in the backend because you've got an inbuilt context of a web request. It starts and it finishes and things happen. It doesn't work well currently in the front end. So it doesn't work well in the client side, the what people call RUM, or real user monitoring. So it doesn't work well in that way. OpenTelemetry is trying to build a signal for that. So in the back end, it's actually really easy. You just add, say, 10 lines of code to your startup and say, I would like to see a span for every HTTP request that I get into my site. I would like to see a span for every HTTP request I make out of my site.
Now, when you say span, there's several definitions of that word, but in this context, what does it mean?
So we're on a .NET podcast, so let's use .NET terms. You can create an activity. So activity, and this is where we say we've had this for ages, because activity has existed since, I think, .NET Core 2.1, I think, was when they first started bringing in activity. It's been there for a while. And activity kind of represents a sort of unit of work, if you like. And you create an activity, you create one for your HTTP inbound requests, one for your outbound requests, one for your when you hit a database. And these are all inbuilt into the libraries already. ASP.NET Core has it, SQL Client has it, MySQL Client has it, MPG SQL, Entity Framework, you name it, all of those have been moved up. Even the Azure client SDKs have now been changed over to using activity sources and activities to create these spans. So a span being this, I've got a start time, I've got an end time, and I've got some attributes. And it allows you to build these really rich waterfalls that allow you to see how things transition through your system. But you can do that with about 10 lines of code in the startup of your application. And with Aspire, they're actually promoting this idea of these shared projects where all of that setup happens once. So it's not even 10 lines of code per application. It's 10 lines of code in a common startup. So you can get essentially all this automatic data just by adding 10 lines of code and then putting in a little bit of config to say where you're going to send it. You're going to put in the Elastic APM endpoints. You're going to put in the Honeycomb endpoints. You're going to put it into any of the endpoints.
And if you want to go further, you can do 0 lines of code as well. So there's also this kind of concept of auto instrumentation where by flicking a few environment variables to configure the profiling hooks that the .NET runtime has built into it. If you can point it at this auto-instrumenting profiler, that can go in and wire up, whether it be the OpenTelemetry SDK or the Elastic APM agent, wire up for you in your application with no code changes at all. Just deploy the environment variables and restart the app, which can be a really good way to get started with.
That's amazing, actually.
Yeah, with basic instrumentation of what's happening.
Guys, you're talking about the easy part, collecting too much data. Like really easy.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
I'm a guy who spent time in the SQL world where we used to do full traces of every transaction going through a SQL server because it was really great at filling up hard drives in a big old hurry. It's the real question is after you gather all this stuff, and emphasis on stuff, I can think of several other words that would apply.
That begin with S.
How do you mash this into submission? And, to the line I would use when working with the team was create actionable items, things we can do to make the system better.
That is the rub, really. And that I think is what has been tracing's downfall for probably the last sort of 5 years, really. Because people see tracing as I have a trace ID and now I can see a trace waterfall for that thing, but I need something else in order to tell me what trace ID to use. And what that means is you end up with, say, 99.9999 recurring % of your data not being used and just sitting on hard drives and costing you money. And that, I think, has been one of the big downfalls that people have said, well, tracing is not really useful because I need to know which trace it was. So I'm just going to use logs because I have to keep them anyway. And I think that's been one of the big downfalls. But I think there's a movement now around tracing, around things like sampling and doing various different mechanisms for how we reduce down the amount of data that we store and only store the interesting stuff.
Yeah, assessing what's interesting is not a trivial problem either, right?
Yeah, I mean, interesting is subjective at best. But the general rule is, you keep every one of your slow traces and keep every one that has an error in it because those are at least going to be the interesting ones. But you do that and then you can start to think about how do I query my trace data? Not how do I query my logs and my metrics and then get back to tracing, but how do I start with that tracing data? Because it's really rich. And I think that's where we're seeing this big change now with OpenTelemetry, because all the back ends now are starting to look at this trace analysis type stuff, whether it's us or Elastic or a lot of the open source ones that are normally based on ClickHouse as a data store. They're starting to do this idea of, well, how do I get and ask questions of my trace data? Because it's really rich. It's really wide. It's got loads of attributes, all that interesting stuff. And that really is the rub.
Yeah, it's always a question of what's actually interesting because you're always afraid of what you shave off because that might have been the interesting data.
But yeah, we've had so many people who come to us with, I don't really like tracing because, every time I wanted to ask a question, the customer got an error, it was sampled out because, or discarded because somebody took 1% of random sample data and the error happens, once in a million times. So they never get the trace that they want. And that's where we're doing a lot of evolution right now in the OpenTelemetry collector. Some of the stuff that even me and Steve were talking about at NDC London, about how we roll up spans and write tail sampling processes that are more bespoke. And, this is the sort of conversations we're having now because it's vendor agnostic. And so you've got so many more people, me and Steve, we don't work for the same company, but we're working towards a common goal of reducing the amount of data, making it more actionable and making it easier for people to implement. So you've got, hundreds of developers all working on that same code base.
And that's the major advantage of OpenTelemetry as a goal, isn't it, for the industry, that rather than every vendor focusing on their way of doing something and having their own little pieces that they can use in sales and marketing, it's actually what's the right solution across the industry for how this should be done in the best way for the organizations that need this information to be able to store this stuff in a sensible, cost-effective kind of way, to do this level of sort of advanced sampling, sort of intelligent sampling, if you will, on the tail of things coming through. And I think we're starting to see that shift with vendors now, kind of all starting to adopt, finally, I think, OpenTelemetry as that solution.
Yeah, it's always a question of managing this data together into, like, do you make sense of it? You see mostly it's the same stuff over and over again. It's what you already know. I'm tapping on the book I've never freaking finished and still hope to one day with the history of .NET, where the SQL team had a tool where anytime a unique execution path happened inside a SQL server, it would stop. It would hit a breakpoint. So as long as it was executing the normal path or normal paths over time, it would continue running. And so it was like a tool designed to find the 1 in 100 million case. So you're iterating rapidly, and it's like initially it's breaking on each unique path. But after you say, okay, that's a fine path, keep going. Then eventually it's like running for days before it's finally like, dink, how about this? You're like, now how the heck did you get there? And the reason it's in the story of the context of .NET is because that's what made .NET 2.0. Making .NET run inside a SQL server made them test .NET in a way it had never been tested before, and they found rare and unusual bugs because they were running in the context of SQL Server. Mm. Here endeth the history lesson.
I love the idea of like the system just going, hold on a minute.
You're doing something new.
Can you just get your supervisor?
Yeah. You've never been down this road before, boys. Let's have a little chat. Yeah. And speaking of that, my friends, let's take a brief break for this very important message. And we're back. It's .NET Rocks. I'm Richard Campbell. That's Martin Thwaites and Steve Gordon and my buddy Carl.
Hey.
And we talk a little bit about more than one way to get observability here. And the fact that, now you're really creating trouble for me. It's not like I wasn't getting too much telemetry out of my Honeycomb stack, but now I'm going to go get Elastic APM as well, feed the same data to it twice because I just own too many drives. Like, let's try and fill them all. Like doing analysis between those data sets could be interesting too.
I mean, we do that a lot, the bake-off type stuff. Once you've got an OpenTelemetry collector in place, you just sort of send it to 5 vendors and see which ones do the best.
Or spit out what you want to hear. In accounting, they call it reconciliation, right? Like you got to add up the numbers more than one way. So I wonder, we're not there yet in our industry. Like if I really wanted to be a pain in the butt about a performance contract, the fact that I could ask the telemetry to be sent to 2 different sources and we'll reconcile the performance metrics against it from 2 different places and see if they actually agree, and when they don't, wonder why. Like, yeah, you could really press against that contract. Yeah. I haven't been an evil CTO in too long. You've given me new ideas.
I'm on behalf of myself, and I am sorry to the industry for unleashing
forth and
Rich.
Crush the souls of more vendors. But yeah, I mean, there's the other side of this is like we're doing multiple analysis on the same sets of data. Hopefully, obviously, different tools, like you said, have better insights in different areas. But yeah, I'd love to have a standard set of comparisons. So it says, oh yeah, no, we reconcile the same way. We agree on stuff. So you get more confidence.
I think there's also different users as well. We've got the, just in the sort of reliability space, you've got developers who are using this information. You've got SREs that are using this information to optimize the infrastructure. You've got platform engineers that are using it for the same things to build tools. That's just 3 users just in engineering. You start to think that what else could we use this information for? I know of a company that's running at the moment the idea of taking metrics to do cost projections.
Right.
So take the metrics of your Kubernetes pod, how much you might need to scale in the future, take that metrics data. Don't allow people to query it and do dashboards, but take it and do projections. Right. This is now into the FinOps world.
Well, this is my admin life, right? Like all too often we'd roll out a new feature and it would tip the system over a week later because we weren't looking at the additional resource impacts. And as as e-commerce sites started getting really big, we were dark launching features and running them on one server just to see what the load differences were. So I knew how much hardware to order, which just speaks to how old I am, right? Because back then it was like, see, we love that feature, but we literally need 30 more servers to roll it out. And
then you end up with one server running on a previous version, and then you bankrupt the company, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, we don't scare me, Martin. But I have used that line in the boardroom where it's like, I think we're about a week away from bankruptcy unless we turn this thing off because we're gonna crush the whole thing. Like we have to think about it. Yeah, it's and it's that whole part about the telemetry part was it's very hard to estimate the impact of a feature. Not only you don't really understand the resource consumption of a feature anyway, but you certainly don't know what the user utilization is going to be. Like you're just making this stuff up, right? So it is only telemetry that really tells us how much is it being used, what's the actual impact on the systems. At least now we're living in a cloud where you can just flip a knob and the CFO will find out about it in about 30 days, right? Like not your problem. You kept the system up. That's my metric. I'm up. Like, I'm good. Oh, what is this about a bill?
And this is the other flip side of that is what we call the nines don't matter if users aren't happy. It's like, 99% uptime. Awesome. 20-second response times though.
That's a good, yeah. But yeah, this is the game we're playing, right? Is looking through all of these things. And really, we came into this conversation talking about what's the app up to. Like, we're not even, here we're talking about important business cases, but mostly it's just trying to diagnose weird behavior. Like, I don't know what's going on.
And I have a customer that can totally use this right now. After upgrading to Blazor in .NET 8 from 6, all sorts of weird things are happening. And we're still using the same services and stuff, just the newer versions. So it's probably just some versioning thing, but weird unhandled exceptions that are evading the error handlers and closing the whole thing and not giving us an opportunity to find out where they are. Like, this is going to be a game changer for them.
So what I should mention at that point is it doesn't work well in Blazor. I'm really sorry.
Oh, no! Dun, dun, dun. Is that just because it's a new stack, or is there something inherent to Blazor?
It's more to do with the front end side. So if you're using Blazor WebAssembly, you have a single thread.
Right.
And telemetry should inherently be done in the background. So the Blazor server has some problems with the gRPC connections and various other bits that we're working on it. I'm currently talking to somebody who runs one of the Blazor University things, who's trying all this stuff out and trying to work out what that should look like for Blazor. But there's a lot of things that are they're new. They're not in the tracing paradigm right now. Durable functions is another one that has some really big, interesting nuances around how do we propagate a context. So how do we say that this function execution was related to this other function execution, and how do we get that data between the two? Because it's not as easy as just pass some HTTP headers. So, we've got Azure Service Bus has similar nuances. But we're seeing right now a lot of open source libraries that are going, I need to add tracing because people want this. They want that internal information. They want to know how the cache server is working. They want to know the messaging systems and how long it takes me to post a message to my messaging system, not just how long it's going to take to receive and process it afterwards. So they're adding it. RabbitMQ recently, in the new version, is going to have tracing as a first-class citizen in there, and then it's going to have metrics as well. Fusion Cache was another one that I worked on with some people, and we just seen loads more people going, yeah, tracing. I need the tracing now. So it's really good to see.
Right.
Yeah, we're at that kind of tipping point of adoption, which is, very encouraging. I think as people get benefit out of the box from all of these libraries they're using, and they're already getting useful traces that tell them a lot of stuff, even without them instrumenting their own code. That's the benefit of everyone. I mean, we recently instrumented the client library for the .NET language client for Elasticsearch. So that's a separate package you pull in if you want to do, .NET code to talk to Elasticsearch. So we've added some instrumentation down in the transport layer so you can kind of see what's going on there. Added our own useful attributes. So out of the box, if you're using that library and you're using an OpenTelemetry capable collection process, then you immediately get that information and you can diagnose what's going on at that level.
Yeah, and Aspire. You had David on talking about Aspire. I think that is going to be the real big game changer in adoption, because one of the big blockers is people like logs. Well, I can see them in my console when I'm running. Why would I use traces? Because I can't see them in my console. But now with Aspire, it's like you've got a nice, convenient little dashboard that's just running there that takes your metrics and your logs and your traces. Yeah. And I'm seeing loads of people use that. They look at the logs thing and then look at the traces thing and say, well, the traces are way richer than the logs. So why would I use the logs? And I'm like, I've been saying this for 5 years. Thank you.
Yeah. But you're right. The one thing I came away with, I came away with many things from David's show, but it was this: we're trying to make all the right defaults for you when you're building a cloud native app. And one of them is you use OpenTelemetry, like you use that level of instrumentation. So, it's exactly that. You have to fight against it now to not have all that stuff in place.
Yeah.
It's the pit of success, isn't it?
Yeah, try it. But it's an interesting point, because there's also folks that are like, I don't know why we need this. And it's like, because it's too many choices. If you're perfect, if you can get everything right every time, if you never need to be more careful because you're always careful, then fine, you don't need it. Mm. But I'm just not that careful.
It's like unit tests.
Spend several days trying to analyze logs in your head and correlate everything across even a good logging system, and you'll soon realize that actually a trace might have saved you a few sort of head against wall moments.
But yeah, just like unit tests. I don't need unit tests. Unit tests for people who don't trust that they can write code right for the first time.
Yeah, that's true.
I know I can't write code right the first time.
A certain quote from a certain Billy Hollis comes to mind.
Yep. You might be addicted to code. You might be.
Yeah. And you must suck as a coder. If you need 2 people writing 10 lines of code for every line of code you write.
Yeah.
Anyway.
He was speaking in the extreme case, but it's like, look, people make mistakes. They get tired. They work too late. They don't quite understand the problem. Like, all of these things are real. And you look at all the work we're doing lately around shortening the internal cycle, the impacts of GitHub Copilot, they're all speaking to the same thing: more correct code. Mm. And Aspire, to me, looks like this tool that says, okay, so you're going to be cloud native, and you haven't done it for 30 years for some strange reason. Mm. So now we're going to give you a tool set, a framework that leads you to that path.
It's a distributed debugger.
Yes.
For the cloud. That's, I joked in some of my talks over the years about you can't attach a debugger to production. Nobody attaches their Visual Studio instance to production. Well, sorry, nobody does it more than once.
It seemed like a good idea.
Yeah. But nobody does that because, well, for a start, it blocks all the threads and stops your server. That's probably a bad thing. But also now you have to attach a debugger to 15 different services, because you've got 5 different services running 3 replicas and you don't know which one it's going to hit. And, we're in this world now where we need that debugging experience. Nothing's changed. We still need to debug our systems, but we need to debug them in an environment where they're replicated and they're distributed. And some of them are using event-driven systems. And you're like, I can't correlate these logs across an hour's worth of time window. And yeah, it's hard. And that's where I think people are getting to now, that they're starting to add tools and tools and tools on top of the old logging systems that they had to try and meet the demands of these distributed systems. And then they realize that actually, no, there's something that's more native that they can use instead. And it requires a paradigm shift. And I think that's where, as an industry, we're bad at.
Just acknowledging that telemetry and logging aren't the same thing. Because they're not, weirdly enough.
But, I've been saying for a while now that if you can answer all the questions that you need from the logs that you've got, you don't need traces.
Yeah, stay still. Fine. Yeah. But the question is, can you? And I don't think you can, or you're not asking good questions. Or
you have no users.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's
as the number of users of this app rises above none. It's an old scalability problem where I found an app where it's like, as long as one person was using this, it was fine. But as soon as 2 did, no, not so good. That was a long time ago. My goodness. Mm-hmm.
I've hit that problem so many times when people use singletons instead of transients, and they store state in a singleton, especially in multi-tenant systems. And it's like, yeah, when we've got 1 tenant, it's fine, but as soon as we get 2 tenants, everybody's got everybody else's data, and that's a bad thing.
Yeah, you think? Holy man! Yeah, easy mistakes to make too, right? Like, you realize we don't think about that anymore. That the framework is just doing that for us now most of the time, as long as you follow the rules. Like we're definitely working on a different tier of problems now as we're used to distributing across multiple machines, and now it's, in different clouds with different platforms. Right? We definitely build way more complicated software. It's no question that we need to change the way we measure them. The debugging story is separate though, right? Like you just sort of casually mentioned the debugging on top of it, but telemetry is not necessarily for debugging, is it?
So it can be for, telemetry isn't a debugging tool, but you can use it for debugging. One of the big things we talk about at the moment is the difference between 3 pillars of observability and just telemetry signals. So the 3 telemetry signals being logs, metrics, and traces. They allow you to do lots of things. They allow you to build dashboards. They allow you to do monitoring, build alerts. You don't need one or more of these. You can use 1, you can use 3. You don't need all of the signals. But when you're trying to do the debugging side, you need to work out which signals you need to do it. And you can correlate them sometimes. One of the key ones is a user request is taking too long, and it turns out it's actually just one pod. Right. And that one pod has its CPU spinning out. And you look at infrastructure metrics for those things. So debugging, or do you call it debugging? Working out what the problem is in production, the root cause analysis.
Diagnostics.
I don't know. Yeah.
Debugging to me speaks to I am fixing code often because I'm looking in an executing environment for what's going on within that code. And I can see having the telemetry sitting beside me because we're seeing a behavior in production. We're not quite sure what it is. And so now I set up a debugging environment to try and capture that.
And I suppose I've been playing with this narrative, and let's try this, which is, I think tracing is kind of like conditional breakpoints that you can use with a time machine. Now, when I discovered conditional breakpoints in .NET, it was like a revelation. When you're running a SPA app on the front end and it's going through this line of code, and you want to know when it hits this line of code, but when it comes from this endpoint is when I want to be able to hit it, because it's hit 16 times and I don't want to have to hit play every time. And I've got multiple threads going on. If you think about that, but being able to do it in production and then say, what happened yesterday when this person hit this endpoint for this particular method or this particular database call? That I think is like this revelation of now you are doing debugging. You're using that telemetry from production to do debugging.
Yeah, to construct an executing environment to recreate the problem in production. Like it gives you the cues to say, we need to be in this state to be able to see this bug.
Yeah, to be able to see those constraints.
Because you still can't set a breakpoint in production. Well, you can, you just won't have a job afterwards. Sorry, Steve, I stepped on you there.
No, I was just, I'm totally on board with, Martin's point there. And I think it's the ability to apply constraints to the data that you have that would be very difficult with just pure logs, where you want to, set up this series of criteria around, I want to look at this coming from this in this region, deployed on this particular piece of infrastructure, and then see a waterfall visually of, okay, what did that flow through in the code? Where are those, lines on this waterfall wider, taking longer? And then you narrow down, okay, well, that's this block of code or this library. That's where I need to go and look to try and find out why that's taking so long, that piece of the puzzle with these given sets of criteria applied to it. And that's something I think only well-defined tracing can really give you. You could sort of get there with logs, but you would take a longer to find there, I think.
Yeah, there's always the question of, do I understand? With any given log set, it's like these 6 logs, where's this particular transaction across these logs? Like we've always had a tough time joining that stuff up, and telemetry does a better job of that.
Yeah, and then relating that back to infrastructure, because, we don't run our code in isolation. Infrastructure is a thing that we use. So yes, it ran slow, but was it running slow because that Kubernetes node was overloaded? Was it running slow because we just switched slots in app service? Though that infrastructure stuff is just as important.
Yeah. Well, it's, again, I've spent a long time on the ops side of this. Like, why is this slow? And it's like, it's your hardware. No, it's your crappy software. Like you go back and forth on that a fair bit. I have had a situation where we had a 100 base T hub in the network we'd forgotten about, and literally was throttling all the network traffic. So, it looked like the database was slow. And it's like, literally, it took a long time for the data to come and go from that because this network mistake was there. Like, those things happen. And the trick is to not be mean about it. Like, everybody sit on the same side of the table in the boardroom with the projector on, going, what is this data telling us?
And that's correlation.
Yeah.
That's that idea of, the ops people are looking at their infrastructure dashboards, and, there's a thing here. And then the developers are looking at their log aggregation dashboards that show them some stuff, and they've got some graphs that they can, it's like, whoa, these two graphs, they go up at the same time. Maybe there is something here.
Is there a knob here that we can wiggle? Like,
just kick it.
Can we change that number for anything? Like, when we do this, does it make a difference? So at least you have a sense that, there's a constraint here, and it's related to this value. And if we modify it, we can improve it in some way. Convincing that we have to buy new hardware is challenging. And again, the cloud took a lot of this away because it costs you nothing to turn that up for a test and then turn it back down again. Like $1. It's just like you solve a lot of problems just by doing those tests.
Yeah. I just ran a workshop on Kubernetes for some attendees, and I span up a Kubernetes cluster for every one of the attendees for 2 days. And it cost me, I think, £4 per attendee to run a 3-node Kubernetes cluster in AKS for 2 days. I mean, can you imagine if you were having to do that on premise and ship in
all that hardware,
3 R300s just for each attendee, and a rack whirring in the background? But we'd have blinky lights, so that'd be a thing.
Yeah, we'd have blinky lights, but you can get a bunch of RGB LEDs, put them in a box, just call it the computer, right? Every time the wire goes back into the cloud.
Might do that for the next workshop. It's like, you're all running those blinky lights in the corner.
Except to see that one that's off. That's Carl. Wake up, Carl. Oh man, what have we not talked about here? Because there's a lot to doing a good job here. What are the learning ingredients? Like, how do people really get? We know it's quick to install, but do you
10 lines of code?
10 lines of code, you're up and running. But there is some things you need to know.
I think start with Aspire. Start with a local dashboard. Start by turning some things on locally in your local development environment, and see what some of these traces look like, and see whether they're useful before you start thinking about where I'm going to put them, what observability backend, what scale do I need? Am I going to use open source and host it myself? Am I going to go with a SaaS vendor? Am I going to go one inbuilt into my cloud? Use Aspire. That's what the real cool thing about it is. It's available as a container now. That you can just run up locally. You don't need to use the DCP and all the other bits that go with it. You can just run it in a container and just experiment with it. What data do you see? Is it going to help you? The value to work ratio should be really small anyway, like 10 lines of code. Great. But start with something like that locally, because you don't need to choose a vendor. I equate this to, you remember when they brought in iLogger? And the great thing about iLogger is it saves 6 months on every project, because the first 6 months of any project was deciding between nlog and log4net or Serilog, and the arguments that people had. I mean, that was the true flame wars, but they brought in iLogger. And the problem was that you needed to make that decision really far up front. Because if you didn't, then you'd have to retrofit it across all of your code that you developed.
And everybody's
They brought in iLogger and just went. They brought in iLogger and they were like, great, everybody use iLogger. It'll just send it through iLogger and then you'll choose your vendor. And I think OpenTelemetry is the same thing.
We've got a gimme now. It should be in everything. Whether you wire it up or not, it costs you nothing to have it there. And when you do wire it up, it'll help.
Yeah, and that's the place to start.
Well, and I like this tipping point angle that Steve brought up, which is that, and more vendors see it that way. And so the information you're getting out of OpenTelemetry just keeps getting better.
Yeah, this whole thing works best as more and more vendors get on board. So that's the library authors, it's the the various different language runtimes, it's the OpenTelemetry team, it's people within your organization, engineers within your organization buying into the fact that, okay, we've got this. I mean, in .NET, it's super easy because we do have activity built in. It's there. If you're using .NET, modern .NET, you've got the libraries, you've got the APIs you need just to turn this stuff on and start instrumenting code.
Yeah.
But as all of these people shift towards that general direction, I think that's why OpenTelemetry now is really starting to look like a good solution for everyone.
What's the App Insights story? Should we just rip it out?
So Application Insights is currently redeveloping all of their SDKs to use Activity Source and Activities, so it's not built in.
You.
Wow.
So
I'm getting those messages saying you're going to have to change this soon. So it shows that even Microsoft's listening to the OpenTelemetry story.
I mean, they had the experimental flags in the Azure SDK last year, I think, and I think those are being removed now. So all the Azure SDKs, anything that you use from Cosmos to Service Bus, Event Grid, all of those things will be instrumented with activities, which means they're compatible with OpenTelemetry to send it. And Azure Monitor, they've got their own exporter now. They don't accept OTLP yet. Whether they will, I don't know. I don't work on that team. But they do have a distro. So you can add Azure Monitor Exporter. And then you can just use OpenTelemetry and decide later where you're going to send it. I'll just add the one line of code that says add to Azure Monitor. And it will appear in App Insights. Everybody's doing it.
And to go back to this Blazor thing, do you recall hearing any kind of timeline as to when things will be more copacetic with tracing and everything else that's going on?
So I had a long conversation with the other Steve at NDC London about exactly that.
The more famous Steve.
You're one of the lesser Steves. Is that what you're saying?
So they're looking at it. They are aware of the issues that are coming up, and they are, wanting to solve them. So I would imagine that yes, they will be solved soon, and you can do it. It's not as easy as 10 lines of code. You've got to go through a few more hoops.
Especially with the whole render mode thing. If you're using dynamic render modes, you've got some other problems that have to get solved first. State problems and things. Something I'm currently working on.
But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for a future where this is the default. This is, I just add those 10 lines of code, or even just add one line of code when we've worked on the SDKs a little bit more. Yeah. And just add the one thing that just says, send my stuff. And, it's what is it? Services.let me debug my things. That kind of simplicity just becomes the new cargo cult, if you like. Yeah. I don't just cargo cult a thing. I do cargo cult a thing, but it's the new thing I cargo cult.
Well, guys, great conversation. Thanks so much for coming on.
Absolutely. And what's next? What's on your inbox, Martin?
So I'm doing a load of conferences. I'm doing some meetups around the UK. I'll be at KubeCon, the Kubernetes Cloud Native Conference in March. But I am flying around the world spreading the good word about this sort of stuff.
How about you, Steve?
Conferences coming up. So I'll be in Sweden next week for SweetHug, which will be in the past by the time this one goes out. And then day to day we're going to be focusing on where Elastic and the engineers can contribute to OpenTelemetry. Really, I'm really starting to poke around in the OpenTelemetry SDK repos and think about how we can make that experience good for everyone. So I think that'll keep me busy for a while.
Yeah, I bet. Well, this is all great news. Thanks again, and I'll catch up with you at some conference somewhere, I'm sure.
One of them,
sure. All right, we'll see you next time on .NET Rocks.
.NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net and produced by Thwaites Studios, a full-service audio, video, and post-production facility located physically in New London, Connecticut, and of course in the cloud. Online at pwop.com. Visit our website at dotnetrocks.com for RSS feeds, downloads, mobile apps, comments, and access to the full archives going back to show number 1, recorded in September 2002. And make sure you check out our sponsors. They keep us in business. Now go write some code. See you next time.
Got transmitter banned by the FCC. Yes, I'm a toy boy.